Was the red wave that wasn't, in my view. The polls are closed after a long night of vote tallying. Control of Congress still hanging in the balance as both parties have yet to firmly wrest control of either chamber. There are hotly contested Senate races that are not completely wrapped up in Arizona and Nevada. Georgia remains too close to call, could be headed to a runoff. Georgia officials saying it's actually safe to say that there will be a runoff after all. Republicans currently hold 49 seats to Democrats 48, and at this point it's anyone's game, although things are looking much better for Democrats than the kind of pundits had it over the last couple weeks. Democrats in battleground districts across the country have managed to hold on to many seats, outperforming initial expectations. So despite that, Republicans still, however, expected to pick up the seats they need to recapture the House in the coming days, though not at all by the margins that some had expected.
So what are the night's biggest wins? In Pennsylvania, Democrats swept the state's Senate and gubernatorial races, delivering wins to Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman and State Attorney General Josh Shapiro. Meanwhile, down south, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp will retain his seat after defeating Democratic hopeful Stacey Abrams, as will Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who sent his Democratic challenger Charlie Crist packing after winning almost 60% of the vote.
In Ohio's Senate race, J.D. Vance, the Republican, beat Congressman Tim Ryan in one of the only victories for a true kind of Trump Republican. Trump-backed candidates who lost their races include Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania and Doug Mastriano, and then also Don Bolduc in New Hampshire. Meanwhile, the fate of MAGA warrior Kari Lake, who's the Arizona gubernatorial candidate, and then Herschel Walker is the Georgia Senate candidate, Blake Masters, the Arizona Senate candidate. Those are undecided still. Here's what the former president himself had to say about his influence before the polls closed yesterday.
The results for Republicans, how much of that will be because of Donald Trump?
Well, I think if they win, I should get all the credit. And if they lose, I should not be blamed at all, okay? But it'll probably be just the opposite. When they win, I think they're going to do very well. I'll probably be given very little credit, even though in many cases I told people to run. And they ran, and they turned out to be very good candidates.
They did not turn out to be very good candidates. Let's just call it what it is. So the polling so far is basically fine, although it was looking maybe a little off in Arizona. Kari Lake right now is I think very much underperforming.
How do you mean the polling is basically fine?
Well, not the punditry, but the polling had this as a pretty tight, a 54% chance of Republicans winning the Senate with maybe a 50-50 or a 49-51 outcome. That is where we're headed right now. Some people got over their skis and said, "Oh, Republicans are going to win. They're going to win New Hampshire too. They're going to win New York governor race."
A lot of people did. So, to what do you attribute that kind of bullish opinion from the right, or from the left as well, about the right?
Yeah, there's so much to get into, but I think. And I said this a couple of weeks ago when the fortunes of the Republicans didn't seem as good. The candidate quality matters. And Trump's bragging there about having picked people like Dr. Oz, who has lost, Blake Masters, who looks likely to lose in Arizona, Herschel Walker, maybe it'll go to a runoff, but he's underperforming Brian Kemp, the gubernatorial candidate, who Trump is no fan of because of the election stuff. Kemp won easily. So it's not a good showing frankly, it's a bad showing for Trump himself.
Where do you put Adam Laxalt hanging on?
Right.
Where do you put J.D. Vance, and what do you do about DeSantis being someone who at one point Trump used to brag a lot about putting on the map?
J.D. Vance is the Trumpiest candidate to have a good night, for sure. Although, remember that Republicans spent $30 million in that race because Tim Ryan ended up being pretty competitive in the polling. That was money that could have been spent in Pennsylvania. It could have been spent in Georgia. It could have been spent in Arizona. So even though, Ohio is a redder state, it was safer for a Trump Republican than in some of these other places. I don't know that ends up being. It's a technical win, so that's all that counts. But there's a larger issue. In Nevada, so my perception of Laxalt, and I'm less familiar with this candidate than the others we've been discussing, is that he has not run in the general election as full. I mean, I think he's certainly conservative, certainly Trump supporting. Don't get me wrong, he is by no means a never Trump person. My understanding is he has not run as a hardcore, let's relitigate 2020 in the same way that Carrie Lake, Blake Masters, and others have. You have some counter.
Yeah.
I mean, Cortez Masto, his opponent, has certainly leaned into the things he has said in the past about the election.
Yeah, and he was on, I believe, Trump's litigation team that was litigating these cases unsuccessfully in the wake of the election. He was not an incidental player. He wasn't someone who made a casual comment about the big lie in the middle of all of this. And certainly, Catherine Cortez Masto has been making quite a bit of it in terms of her messaging, and I wonder how much of an effect that had in the state as well.
But Blake Masters ran an ad saying, I believe Donald Trump won the 2020 election. This is the Arizona Senate candidate. That hurts you. Arizona's a divided state. Nevada's a divided state.
Well, what about
I don't think
substantively?
Laxalt did that.
Because there has been a lot of commentary about how Democrats were misreading the room with respect to not focusing on inflation and not focusing on crime. I went back through yesterday and listened to a lot of the stump speeches and commentary and debates or whatever kind of a debate-like event that these people had. And Republicans were hitting that messaging strong. It does not seem to have panned out. What do you make of the rhetoric that says people rank the economy, crime, et cetera? Democrats are soft in those issues. Did Republicans fail to deliver substantively on a pitch about what they were affirmatively going to do about those issues? And did that ultimately hurt them?
I think I agree with you in part and maybe partly disagree. Lee Zeldin, the New York gubernatorial candidate, Republican candidate, so he lost. He did pretty well. He historically the best showing for a Republican in a very long time, explicitly running on the crime issue. So I don't know that shows that Republicans were wrong to lean into that or they didn't offer anything. However, it is clear that despite all the polling we have, despite all the focus groups, everything we have suggesting that voters are fed up with the economic situation and do not trust and do not appreciate what the Biden administration's plan for it is, they did not think Republicans had anything to do about it. They did not turn to Republicans to fix it, perhaps because, and I know you've asked a couple Republican guests we've had on the show, well, what are you actually going to do?
Yeah.
They haven't had satisfying answers. I can admit that.
Yeah.
That certainly could have hurt. And look, abortion did clearly hurt in some ways. We're having the results we expected 4 months ago, basically, that despite all the unpopularity of the Biden administration or them not really connecting, the bad situation, voters do not want, I think, the hardest right social conservative version that Republicans have served up. They've said no to that.
Drag shows didn't make the people turn out in the way that they expected.
What a surprise that Americans I mean, you're right, though, that there is a kind of leaning so far into the culture war, an issue that doesn't have a lot of policy ramifications.
That's also not the economy. It's also not inflation.
It's also not talking about the economy. I don't think you're wrong about that.
Well, Democrats faced flack in recent weeks for the party's focus on Roe v. Wade, with critics noting that abortion messaging came at the almost total expense of messaging on the economy. So how did the issue perform at the ballot yesterday? Voters in Michigan, California, and Vermont all voted to approve constitutional amendments protecting the right to abortion. Meanwhile, an anti-abortion measure in Kentucky continues to falter, with current tallies showing 56% of voters disapprove of the referendum.
Nationwide exit polling conducted by NBC News shows that abortion ranked just behind inflation when it came to issues driving voters to the polls, and they're followed by crime, guns, and immigration. So, yeah, I think it'd be hard to say it didn't have an effect. Clearly it did. Look, I think the message to Republicans is pretty clear. In fact, it was clear even before this. It's like I'm seeing all these Republicans saying, man, Trump is just an albatross around our neck. We have to be rid of him. Was that not clear when he, through his buffoonery, caused Republicans to lose the Georgia runoffs? Was that not clear when he himself was defeated in a presidential election? He has won one election against Hillary Clinton, a very historically disliked Democratic candidate who ran a disastrous, who just like forgot to campaign in the two states that were most important.
Yeah.
And he won under those circumstances and has not won and has not delivered any political victories, campaign
Well,
focused
look,
victories
that's one
for
more victory
Republicans.
than Stacey Abrams has had under her belt. and it's
we're gonna
fascinating.
get to her later, and we're also gonna get to Ron DeSantis, who did have a good night. We're gonna talk about that.
Yeah, but the point about women is an interesting one. I believe Fetterman won 57% of the female vote. Another story that we should get into later today is the value of the youth vote, which I think is wrapped up in also the concerns about abortion and the lack of potency in some of the conservative messaging that didn't get to core issues. Also, there was a lot of hand-wringing. Tim Ryan, who lost, was very anti-student debt cancellation. And there are people who are saying that that was a huge mistake and that youth turnout was riding on the wings of promises, as yet unfulfilled promises, but promises nonetheless from the Biden administration to do something about the student debt crisis. So a lot of moving parts here.
A lot of moving parts. If I was Republicans, I would say, how can we clone Brian Kemp's and Glenn Youngkin's of the world? These seem to be the Republicans who are acceptable to moderate or swing or independent voters, not the likes of Dr. Oz and Blake Masters, et cetera. Well, we will absolutely be discussing more of the election results all show, really. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a minute.